But today we're finishing up our series called Survival Guide. And we've been talking about a very big, hot-button issue. It's about marriage, it's about relationships, and this has been such an important series because a lot of marriages are finding it really challenging right now. We've talked about the pandemic pressure cooker that we're all in, and how families and marriages and couples are stressed, just because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions that we're walking through and all of the challenges that has brought to our lives and our homes, whether it's schooling or job or financial pressures or just the isolation and not being able to connect with people that we would normally connect with. And we've all experienced that pressure, and it's been really hard on marriages. And so we've decided, we needed to talk about this, and so this is what this series has been about. And so this morning we're going to wrap this series up. But before we get into this, I need to say something that's really important. Okay, this is really important. So if you're sitting with somebody, maybe just, give them a little nudge and just say, hey, pay attention, because this is really important, okay? Really important. Are you ready for this? This is what I need to say. Marriage is awesome, but it's not everything. Okay? And we just need to understand that marriage is awesome, but it's not everything. And if you're not married, that's okay. It's okay. It's okay not to be married. You don't have to be married to be normal. You don't have to be married to have a great life. Even if some of your married friends sometimes forget about that, it's true. You don't have to be married to have a great life. And so while marriage is a gift, it's God's idea, it's precious. You don't have to be married to be fulfilled. You don't have to be married to be a whole person. In fact, the person that we serve, the person that we follow, lived his entire life as a single adult, right? His name is Jesus. So if you're not married, you're actually in pretty good company. And the other thing that we've been talking about in this series is that the fact that marriage is not the magic pill for a happy life. In fact, marriage can be difficult. It can be a challenging journey. And in fact, my mom used to say, it's better to be single and wish you were married than to be married and wish you were single. That's just kind of the truth, right? So if you're not married, we love you. If you're not married, thank you for allowing us to take a few weeks and talk about marriage. Thank you for praying for your married friends and their marriages. Thank you for supporting their marriages and this idea of marriage. And so next week, we're going to move on to something else. We're going to talk about something else. But this morning, let's wrap up this Survival Guide series. John Gottman is a clinical psychologist, a professor at the University of Washington, and he's been studying marriage and marriage questions for years. Some of you have probably read some of his stuff or heard about them. I know Pastor Chantel's a big fan, and she's read all the books on marriage. She's the resident marriage expert, and so she likes Gottman. So anyway, after years of research, John Gottman says that he could actually predict in about 5 minutes whether a couple will stay happily together or lose their way. And he says he can do this in about 5 minutes and with 91% accuracy. And this is not just a gut feeling. This is not just an opinion he has. This is actually based on scientific studies of hundreds of couples for decades, like 30 years. And from all of that research and from all of that work, he's identified some myths that many of us have about successful marriage. Myths that our culture believes about what makes a marriage work. And I think these are some helpful thoughts as we're kind of in this pandemic pressure cooker. So some myths about marriage. Number one, good communication is the key to a happy marriage. That's actually a myth. Now, I do a bit of premarital counseling, and one of the things that most couples want to work on is their communication skills, and they often see that as a growth area in their relationship. And so we spent some time working on something that is called active listening skills. And one person is asked to share what they're thinking using I statements. So it'd be like, I'm concerned about, how much time we spend watching Netflix, or I'm concerned about, maybe how much money we're planning to spend for our wedding. And their partner is supposed to listen to what they say and then paraphrase and kind of respond back to them what they hear. So they're supposed to say, well, what I hear you saying is that you think we're spending too much time watching Netflix, binging on Netflix. Or what I hear you saying is that, we're planning to spend too much money on our wedding. And they're not supposed to comment or editorialize or share their thoughts. They're just supposed to reflect what they hear their spouse saying or their partner saying so that their partner knows they've been heard and understood. And it's a fun exercise. It's a good relationship skill. But Dr. Gottman would say that when it comes to resolving conflict in marriage, it doesn't work. Now, don't tell the couples they've done premarital counseling that, but actually, I would agree, because one of the most startling findings of Gottman's research is that most happily married couples rarely do anything that comes close to active listening when they're in conflict. Why? Because they're in conflict. They're upset about something, right? Now, good communication skills, good communication habits are a benefit to every marriage relationship, and Aileen and I do practice active listening from time to time, especially when we want to kind of, hear what's going on in each other's hearts, but it's not the secret sauce to a happy marriage. In fact, good communication is not the key. Now, happy marriages will probably have good communication, but good communication is not really the key to a happy marriage. So that's a myth. Another myth about marriage is that personality problems will ruin your marriage. Personality problems will ruin your marriage. And John Gottman would say that's a myth. This myth says that marriages fail because one of the people in the marriage, or maybe both of the people in the marriage, are crazy, neurotic, irrational, kind of nuts. And your relationship is doomed if one of you have personality issues or weird habits or other flaws that make you a strange person. Well, here's the reality. We're all a little crazy. We're all a little crazy. We all have our crazy buttons. Just ask my wife. I am not as sane as I seem. There's not many people in the room here this morning, but there's a lot of amens, okay? But I'll tell you, my wife is not as sane as she seems either. We're each of us are a little bit crazy. And in fact, my observation is that some of the happiest couples I know have a fairly high level of crazy. That's just the way we are. And that's not to say that personality problems and personality issues can't be a huge issue in your marriage, because obviously they can. And we, in fact, need to be very careful about who we marry, right? My dad used to say, keep your eyes wide open before you're married and half shut afterwards. And I think, again, my mom and dad, they were married for 40 years. They had some of this stuff figured out. I think that's true. Keep your eyes wide open before you're married and half shut afterwards, right? Because there's going to be things that you don't find out about your spouse until after you've been living with them for a while, right? There's going to be things there that probably show that they're either a little crazy or will drive you a little crazy. But here's the good news. That doesn't necessarily ruin a marriage. Now, it can make your marriage more challenging. It will probably make your marriage more interesting. But it's how you deal with those things that actually makes the difference. And so you can be a little crazy and still have a great marriage. And if you're sitting with your spouse watching this, why don't you just turn to them, look them in the eye, and just say, honey, there's hope for us. All right, another myth about successful marriage is this: conflict will ruin your marriage. If you fight, if you argue, if you have heated moments, that's a sign that your marriage is in trouble. And you need to learn to be nice to each other. Well, Gottman would say that's a myth. Here's another myth that some people believe. Avoiding conflict will ruin your marriage. You just got to tell it like it is. You got to speak your mind. You got to get it out in the open, and you got to hash it out. And you know what? If things get a little emotional and if things get a little loud, well, that's just the way it is. Because avoiding conflict will ruin your marriage. Well, that's actually a myth. Here's the truth. Different couples have different ways of dealing with and expressing conflict in their relationship. And it's not if you have conflict, it's when you have conflict. Because you know what? If you're living with somebody 24/7 in that kind of relationship, it's going to happen. And some of us in our relationships, we will avoid the fight at all costs. You know, we will get the broom, we will sweep it under the rug, and then we will not move the rug. You know, that is our way of dealing with conflict. Other couples, man, if it's not loud, they're not really talking. That's just the way they are. And then some couples, they will talk it out without raising their voice. And sometimes those conversations can get really nasty. Because all of those conflict styles can be unhealthy. All of them can be harmful. Some things you can't sweep under the rug. Some things you just shouldn't sweep under the rug. And sometimes fights are too loud, too often. And sometimes they get mean or violent. And you know what? Those kind of things can actually create insecurity in your kids. They can annoy the neighbors. So that's not necessarily healthy. And sometimes you just shouldn't be calm. You know, when you're in conflict. Sometimes you actually need to get in touch with your emotions and actually feel what you're feeling and talk about how you're feeling. And so there's really no right or wrong way to deal with conflict in your relationship. However you do it, you just need to learn to do it in a healthy way, not a harmful way. Right? Not a hurtful way. So Aileen and I are definitely the talk it out calmly and, don't raise your voice kind of couple, because we decided long ago that we didn't like that kind of tension or heat in our home and in our relationship. And so we're going to talk it out calmly, hopefully rationally, not always rationally, but, that is what works for us. But we think that's a great way to deal with conflict in our relationship. But after being married for 30 plus years and observing other marriages, I realized that is not the secret to a happy marriage. Now, it's one of them for our marriage, but it's got a lot to do with our personalities. It's got a lot to do with our upbringing, our culture. And you know what? If you ever get a chance to take like a Berkman personality profile or inventory, do that. Do some work on understanding yourself and your spouse. Get into the Enneagram stuff. That can be really helpful. I'm an Enneagram 3. My wife is an Enneagram 9. That's kind of help us understand each other. And by the way, in this series, I've been joking that Aileen and I have been married for 33 long years. And it's a joke, okay? Well, I came home the other Sunday, and Aileen had been watching the live stream, and she said, honey, that was a good message. But you do know that we've been married for 32 years. So I did the math, and then I said, yeah, but it seems like 33. You know what? I love my wife, and we have a great relationship. But we've had our moments. And so anyway, Gottman lists a bunch of other myths that we often think make a marriage fail or succeed. But here's the thing, and we've talked about this in this series. A good marriage is not a problem-free marriage. And I don't mean that as a discouraging thing. I actually mean that as an encouraging thing. Because if you're hitting some bumps in your marriage, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have a good marriage. In fact, this good marriage is not a problem-free marriage, is why fairy tales always end with the wedding. Have you noticed that? They meet, they battle the dragon, they fall in love, they get married at the castle, and then it says they lived happily ever after, the end. And I always used to think that they had to end the story there because once they got married, things got boring. But it's actually because once they got married, things got difficult. It got challenging, and maybe it wasn't quite so happily ever after, because a good marriage, a happy marriage, is never a perfect marriage. There's no such thing as a perfect marriage. And one of the problems we have is our expectations, our idealism. It gets in the way of the reality that marriage is a union of two imperfect people that are just trying to make it through life. And if you have unrealistic expectations, you will be disappointed. So understand that even a good marriage is going to have its moments, it's going to have its challenges, and then you throw in things like pandemics, and you know what? Things can get really complicated, really challenging. And so if you are having challenges, it doesn't mean you don't have a good marriage. It doesn't mean that your marriage is over. It doesn't mean that you're doomed to fail. It doesn't mean that you're going to stay unhappy. In fact, I believe that you can move the needle on your marriage from just surviving to thriving. This morning, I want us to go back to that little letter that Paul wrote to his friends in the city of Philippi. It's a great letter. It's a happy letter written to a great church, and one of the themes of the letter is joy. But what we forget is that there was actually some serious conflict in that church. There were a couple of ladies that were not getting along, and if you go to chapter 4, verse 2, it says this. Paul writes, he says, "Now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche, please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement." Settle your disagreement. And, we have to stop and think about that, because this obviously was a serious enough disagreement that Paul had not only heard about it wherever he was not in Philippi at the time, but not only had he heard about it, but he thought it was important enough to actually address it in the letter that he was writing to the entire church. And so he says, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. And then he goes on and he says, "I ask you, my true partner, to help these two women, for they've worked hard in telling others the good news." And so just like the other passages that we've looked at in this series, Paul is not giving a marriage seminar here in Philippians chapter 4, right? He's just talking about the reality of relationships and the reality that there's going to be disagreements. But what Paul says for the church, I think, is actually gold for marriages. Paul's concern was that Euodia and Syntyche didn't get stuck in their disagreement. They were good people. They loved Jesus. They had served Jesus and were working for him. But they were having a problem. And so Paul says, hey, some of you friends need to come alongside of them and help these ladies work it out. As Pastor Chantel said last week, we need to be careful about who we allow to speak into our lives and who we allow to speak into specifically our marriage relationship. Not everyone is going to be helpful in speaking into our lives and our relationships, because not everyone honors marriage. Not everyone is going to support your marriage, and you need to find friends who will honor marriage, who will support marriage, who will encourage your marriage. And Paul was asking for people who valued relationship and people who valued the church to come alongside of Euodia and Syntyche and encourage them and help them work it out. And sometimes we need to do that as well in our marriage relationships. Now, Paul goes on to say a lot of great things here in this passage, and I think all of this needs to be read in the context of relationship and this issue that these two ladies were having. But we're going to dive down to verse 8, and it's a famous verse. It's a verse that if you've been in church world for a while, you probably know. But it's a verse that we probably don't think about in the context of relationships. But I think this verse gives us one of the most underestimated, most underrated, most undervalued relationship tools that, if we will put it to work in our lives, can actually transform our relationship, can actually transform our marriage, can actually help move the needle in our relationship from survive to thrive. So look at what verse 8 says. It says, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise." Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Have you ever thought about that verse in the context of relationships? Have you ever thought about that verse in the context of your marriage? I love what Andy Stanley says. He observes that in every relationship there are going to be gaps between what we expect and want our partners to do and what they actually do. There's going to be a gap between our expectations and their actions, right? We expect our spouse to be home for supper. They said they'd be home by 5 p.m. Now it's 5:45. And so there's this gap between our expectations and the reality of what's happened, right? Our spouse said that, they would clean out the garage last Saturday. And it hasn't happened. So there's this gap between our expectation and what's happened, right? Maybe they said that they would go online and they would pay that bill, and then we're walking by the desk and we notice that the bill's still lying there and they haven't been online to pay the bill. There's the gap between the expectation and the action. They said they wouldn't buy this or spend money on that, and what did they do? They went, there's this gap between the expectation and the action. And at some point in every relationship, especially in close relationships like family relationships and marriage relationships, romantic relationships, there's going to be a gap between what you expect someone to do and what they actually do. It may be an expectation that you've talked about. It may be just an expectation that you have in your own head. But at some point, there's going to be a gap between your expectations and their actions. And the question is what are you going to do with the gap? What are you going to do with the gap? Because in our minds, we immediately go somewhere, don't we? We go somewhere. And I'm not talking about what you say to them when you see them. I'm talking about what you think about when you notice the gap. Because eventually you're going to talk about this, but I'm talking about what goes through your mind when you face the gap between your expectations and your partner's actions. And friends, this works in marriage relationships, but it works in any relationship. It's like the British say, we need to learn to mind the gap. And they're talking about that little space between the platform and the subway train, right? Mind the gap. What do you do with the gap? Well, you can do one of two things with the gap. You can, A, believe the best, or you can assume the worst. In the gap between your expectation and the action, you have this moment where you can either believe the best or you assume the worst. So they're late coming home. Are you going to believe the best or are you going to assume the worst? Are you going to say, wow, they must have had a rough day at work? Or maybe traffic is really bad. Or are you going to say, they are so inconsiderate. They said they'd be home at 5 p.m. They're not home at 5 p.m. Again, they don't even have the courtesy to phone. Or maybe he didn't clean up the garage or do the chore. Do you go, well, you know what? He'll get it done. Saturday, it was a snow day. We had so much fun playing with the kids. Or do you go, you know what? He never follows through. He never does what he says he's going to do. I have to do everything around here. Or maybe you notice that you're off budget again. And so what do you say? When you notice the gap between your expectation and the action, do you say, well, you know what, there's a lot going on this month. We had some catch up to do after Christmas. She's working at it. Or do you just go, you know what, she's no good with money. Her mother was no good with money. It's like we're never going to get out of it. It's like, do I have to do everything? You see, there's that moment between what you expect and what you see as the reality. What do you do in that moment? Now, eventually you've got to have a clarifying conversation, right? About all that kind of stuff. But before you have that conversation, what's the conversation you're having in your head? What are you doing with the gap between your expectation and their actions? Are you believing the best or are you assuming the worst? And that's where I think we need to go back to Paul's wisdom in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. And he says this, he says, now, dear husbands and wives, okay, this is the Darcy translation, okay? Now, dear husbands and wives, one final thing about your marriage, because this is our last message in this series, right? One final thing about your marriage. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Learn to believe the best about your spouse. Don't assume the worst about them, but choose to believe the best. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Here's something that psychologists have known for a long time. You see what you want to see. You see what you look for. It's called confirmation bias. You see what you want to see. And basically, it's the tendency that we all have to interpret or to understand or see things in a way that confirms or supports what we already think. We already have an opinion. We already have an idea. And because we have that opinion, because we have that idea, we're going to see things in a light that supports that idea or supports that understanding. And if you assume the worst, you're going to see the worst. We think our husband is always late. We think our husband is inconsiderate. Then we're going to see everything through that lens. We're going to see every time that he's late. And you know what? We're probably going to miss the time when he's not. If we think our wife is terrible with money, you know what? We're going to see everything through that lens. We're going to see every penny that gets spent poorly, and we're probably going to miss those moments where she turns dimes into dollars because of her confirmation bias. We see what we want to see. But, and friends, here's the thing that we need to understand. If we will believe the best, we will see the best. If we believe the best, we will see the best. I've been reading through Proverbs a lot recently, and it says this in Proverbs 11:27. If you search for good, you will find favor, but if you search for evil, it will find you. It all depends on what you're looking for. You're going to find what you are looking for. And so, friends, we need to be really careful about what we're looking for. And friends, it is so much easier to be negative. I mean, if you search for good, you're going to find that. But you know what? If you search for evil, it's actually going to come looking for you. It's always easier to be negative. There's a story about a vulture and a hummingbird that were flying over the same desert, and the vulture was looking for death and decay to eat on. And you know what? The vulture found death and decay. But the hummingbird was looking for life. It was looking for nectar in a flower. And the hummingbird had a look, but he did find that flower. Friends, they both found what they were looking for. So you have to be careful what you look for. And you know what? If there's any secret to a happy marriage, if there's anything that we can end this series on that's going to help you shift your relationship from survive to thrive, I think this is it. What are you looking for? Because you see what you want to see. The past few weeks, Aileen and I have been doing some reading plans on YouVersion on marriage, and we've been doing it together. It's been fun. They've got some great plans on marriage. They're there, so we've been reading them together. We've shared them with each other, so we're friends on. Can you imagine being friends with your spouse on YouVersion? I mean, isn't that romantic? Wow. So anyway, we're friends on YouVersion. We share these plans, and so we'll read them, and then we'll comment, and we'll read each other's comments, and then we'll talk about them. It's actually been a lot of fun. It's been good. I would recommend it. So one of the plans that we've been looking at is a plan by Roseanne Parks called Marriage Matters, and would recommend this one. Find it, do it with your spouse this week. 8-day plan. Anyway, on day 2 in the devotional, she says, the day we got married, we were eager to say yes, and I do, and I will, till death do us part, bring it on. We wanted to be married. We were excited. And she said, we were going to be different from all those marriage statistics of failure. We were going to soar through our marriage on our true love. Well, several years later, after 4 children, 2 career adjustments, we were not soaring anymore. In fact, we were having to choose to love one day at a time. Drowning in a million things to do, I found myself resenting all the things that my husband was and wasn't doing. But then at a conference, we were challenged to make a list of 10 things that we love about our spouse, and then place that list on our bathroom mirror so that we would see it and remember it. And if we were feeling especially out of touch and could not think of anything that we loved about our spouse, and you know what? Sometimes that's where we end up. But if we couldn't think about anything that we loved about our spouse, we were to go back to pondering, that time when we were engaged, when we were in that pre-wedding period, and we were looking forward to get married, and we were to have that person write the list. The person that was thrilled and willing to marry, excited about marrying this person. She says, in doing so, I was reminded about several reasons that I got married. Several reasons that had just seemed to disappear in a fog of busyness and a fog of life. And the enemy had come to destroy my marriage, but I was participating. I had been disobedient to God's word that told me to focus on all that was praiseworthy. All that was praiseworthy about my husband. All that was praiseworthy about my children. About my full life. No spouse or child is perfect. We're all sinners, and it takes a lot of love and grace to live with your tribe. But she says, I was determined to start focusing on all that was praiseworthy and give my control freak a rest. She said, I was on a praiseworthy hunt. And after identifying anything that was edifying or uplifting about someone in our household, I would speak about it and I would celebrate it. Any act of kindness, generosity, any service became a party to celebrate. And she says, I want to challenge married couples to find that which is praiseworthy. Find that which is praiseworthy about your spouse, and then celebrate it with gratitude for such. Go on a treasure hunt that will occupy all of your married days. And so as we wrap the series up this morning, I just want to challenge you to go on a treasure hunt. Go on a praiseworthy hunt. Make a list of things about your spouse that you actually love, or maybe things, if you have to go back to those days when you were engaged or looking forward to get married, or the early years of marriage. What were some of those things that you loved about your spouse? Make a list of them, even if they're small, even if they're insignificant. But go looking for things that are true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. And I know you may have to hunt for a while. But you have to celebrate even the little things. But you're going to see what you look for, friends. You're going to see what you look for. If you look for death and decay, you'll find it. If you look for life, if you look for nectar, you're going to find that too. You can either assume the worst or you can believe the best. You say, Darcy, that's easy for you to say. You don't know my wife. You don't know my husband. You don't know our marriage. You don't know our situation. And that's right, I probably don't. But here's something that Pastor Chantel said last week that was pure gold. And she learned this from one of her mentors. She said, marriage is like a dance. If one person changes their footwork, the whole dance can change. Marriage is like a dance. If one person changes their footwork, the whole dance can change. And friends, this isn't about what your spouse has or hasn't done. This isn't about what your husband or your wife has or hasn't done. This is about what you will do. Will you change the dance? Will you look at things? Will you go on a praiseworthy hunt and look for things that are praiseworthy, that are excellent, that are worthy of praise? Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that you can help us shift the needle, Lord, in our marriages. You can help us shift the needle in our relationship. Lord, we know that it's not going to be easy. Lord, I know that it's probably not going to be fast. For some of us, it's taken us years to get to this place. It's probably going to take us months and maybe even years to rebuild. But Jesus, I thank you that with your help we can do that. I thank you that with your help you can bring healing. I thank you that with your help you can bring restoration. Jesus, I thank you that by the help of your Spirit you can help us to see things that are true and good and kind and pure and trustworthy. Lord, you can help us see the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. And God, as we go on this praiseworthy hunt, I pray that you would help me in my marriage and help each of my friends in their marriage to change the dance, change their steps, so the dance will change. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Hey, if you haven't done so already, you need to go online. You need to get your date night goodie bag and spend some time with your spouse, even if it's at home in the next few weeks here, because we want you to have a successful, thriving marriage. And God bless you as you do that. Let's sing this together.
All we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring. You're worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you.
thank you so much for joining with Generations Church and our worship experience today. If you need prayer, our hosts would love to pray with you. You can just press the prayer button and they will just stay online for a little while longer. And may God bless you and your families this week in whatever season you find yourself in. Take care.